Hello, and welcome to this lesson, which is going to be about generating kubeconfigs for the cluster. So we're going to be generating a series of kubeconfig files that are going to be used later on to set up our Kubernetes cluster. And we're going to generate these kubeconfig files using kubectl. And basically what we're going to do in these commands is we're going to set up a configuration within kubectl and save that configuration to a kubeconfig file. So we're going to use a kubectl config set cluster command to set up the configuration for the location of the cluster, and then we will do set credentials to set up the username and client certificates that will be used for authentication. Then we will set the context to default, and then we will make sure that we're using that default context in the kubeconfig file. And that's just going to ensure that each one of those files is currently set to use the context that contains all the configurations that we provided in the previous commands. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. It'll probably make a little more sense to you when we actually demonstrate how to do all this. So here are the actual kubeconfig files that we need to generate. There are multiple files, and in the end, we're going to have 6 kubeconfig files. We're going to have kubeconfigs for the kubelet service, but we're going to have 2 of those because we're going to have 1 for each node. Then we will have a single kubeconfig for kubeproxy, 1 for kubecontroller manager, 1 for kubescheduler, and finally 1 for the admin user. If you don't know what all those services are, then that's fine. Just wait until a little bit later in the course when we actually go to install and set up those various services. I'll provide some additional information about what they do and how they function together. So for now, all you need to know is that we need to generate kubeconfig files for all of these services. So let's just jump right into a demonstration of how we can generate these kubeconfig files. As you can see, I'm just here on my local machine, and this is the same place where I generated the certificates in the last section. So if I list my files, you can see I've got all my certificate files there, and we're going to need those certificate files because we're going to use them to generate some of our kubeconfigs. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start by generating kubeconfigs for kubelet. And I need to generate 2 of those, 1 for each of the worker nodes. So I'll just clear my screen so you can see a little more easily what I'm doing. And I'm going to set an environment variable, and I'm going to call this Kubernetes address. And I need to input for that variable the private IP address of my cloud server that I'm going to be using as my load balancer. So here I am looking at my list of cloud servers, and you may remember that I said I was going to use server number 6 as my Kubernetes API load balancer. And I need to copy the private IP, and I'll explain in just a moment why exactly we need to do that. But for right now, I'm going to copy this private IP of server number 6, which I'm going to use as my load balancer. And I'm going to come back here, and I'm just going to paste in that address. And now I'm going to run a command, and it's actually going to be a loop command. And you can find all these commands, by the way, in the description to this video. I'm just going to go ahead and paste the first line of that command here, and you can see that it's going to be a for loop. The reason I only pasted the first line is because I actually need to edit these 2 values here. These, where it says a worker1 hostname and worker2 hostname, those are just placeholders. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that, and I'm going to replace it with those 2 host names. So if I come back here to my cloud servers, my first worker is actually server number 3, and my second worker is server number 4. So worker1 hostname, that's going to be the public hostname of my first worker, which is going to be server number 3. So that's going to be this right here. Mine's wboyd3. Of course, if you're following along, yours is going to be different. So make sure that you use your hostname. I'm going to copy that hostname. And I'll come back here and paste it in. Then I'll put a space. And then I'll come back and copy the second hostname. So I've got wboyd3 and wboyd4.mylabserver.com. And I'll just hit enter there. to go to the next line of my loop, and then I'm going to paste in the rest of this loop command. And here's where I'm going to explain in a little more detail exactly what's going on here before I execute this command. So you'll notice here in this first command, we're setting up the cluster information. And as you can see, we've got our certificate authority. So there's where we need that certificate authority cert file. And I'm referencing this Kubernetes address variable. That's the variable that I set right here at the top. And if you remember, that is the private IP of my load balancer. So here's what this does. This value right here is going to determine where our kubelet service is going to locate the Kubernetes API. So when it reaches out to the Kubernetes API, which it's going to need to do in order for our cluster to work, it's going to use this address. And this is where I determine what IP address or address it's going to use in order to communicate with the API. So here's that architecture diagram. You may remember this from an earlier lesson. And if you look down here, you can see kubelet is one of the services on each of our worker nodes. And kubelet is the service that we are setting up a kubeconfig for right now. And it needs to communicate with the Kubernetes API. And that's represented by this kube API server service that's running on both of the controller nodes. But in this particular architecture, we're actually using a Nginx load balancer to load balance traffic to the kube API server. So we have the kube API server, and it's going to be running on two nodes, controller 1 and controller 2. And we're going to load balance that traffic through this server. So kubelet and kubeproxy are actually going to not talk directly to either controller 1 or controller 2. They're going to talk to the load balancer. And that is why we are putting in the private IP of our load balancer for this address right here, because that is what we're going to use for kubelet to communicate to the actual Kubernetes API. And you'll notice we'll do the same thing for kubeproxy as well, because kubeproxy also uses that same method of going through the load balancer. So let's talk a little bit more about what's going on in this loop. We're looping over these two values, and that is being set to this value called instance. So when we reference instance, we're just referencing this value, and then the second time this loop runs, it will reference that value. So we're storing it in a kubeconfig file that's going to be called wboid3.mylabserver.com.kubeconfig. And we're setting up the address here. Here's where we're setting up the credentials. We're actually giving it a username that is going to be named after the instance. So it's going to be system node wboid3.mylabserver.com. And we're referencing those client certificate files. If you remember, we actually generated certificate files for each of those servers. So I'm going to have a wboid3.mylabserver.com.pem, and of course also for wboid4, and my key file for the certificate. And down here, I'm specifying the user again. And I'm going to ultimately put all this configuration into the appropriate kubeconfig file. So let's just execute that command. And if I do an ls, you'll notice that I now have those two kubeconfigs. So there's the one for wboid3, and there's the one for wboid4. So now I have generated the kubeconfigs for my kubelet services, and that's actually the most complicated one. The rest of these are going to be pretty easy. So I'm going to clear the screen so that you can see what's going on here. And I'm just going to enter another command. And what I'm doing now is I'm generating the kubeconfig for kubeproxy. Now for kubeproxy, we don't need two separate files for each worker node. We just need one file, and the two worker nodes are going to share that file. We're just going to have a copy of that same file on each worker node. So we only need to generate one right now. And you'll notice we're referencing that Kubernetes address again, which is that load balancer IP, because kubeproxy, just like kubelet, is going through the load balancer to access the API. So I'm going to run that, and I will have my kubeproxy.kubeconfig. Now I have three more kubeconfigs that I need to generate, and these ones are even simpler than the one we just did. I'm just going to paste in that command for the kube controller manager, and here we're generating another kubeconfig for kube controller manager. Now you'll notice something a little different. I'm not referencing the load balancer IP here. This is actually the default IP for localhost. So in this instance, Kube Controller Manager is not going to be going through the load balancer. It's going to be accessing the API on whichever server it is on. So it will be accessing the API on localhost using this IP. So why is that? Well, you'll notice Kube Controller Manager is one of our services that's running on our controllers. So it kind of doesn't make sense for Kube Controller Manager to route through the load balancer because it's on the same server as the Kube API server service. So it can just access that service on the same server that Kube Controller Manager is on. So we don't need that to be going through the load balancer. We can just access it on localhost. And the same will hold true for Kube Scheduler as well. So I'm going to execute this command. And then I can do the same thing for Kube Scheduler. And this is pretty much the same set of commands. I'm just referencing Kube Scheduler all throughout instead of Kube Controller Manager. And of course, I will have my Kube Scheduler kubeconfig now since I ran that command. And last but not least, I need to generate a kubeconfig for the admin user. And again, this is just a pretty simple command, very similar to the one we just ran, except we were referencing admin all the way throughout. So I will run that. And then you can see I have my admin.kubeconfig. Now I want to do one more thing before I end this lesson, and that is I want to show you the contents of one of these kubeconfig files. We're not going to go through all of them. We're just going to look at one. And I'll just pick the wboid3 one. That's going to be the one that's for kubelet on my wboid3 cloud server. I just want to show you the contents. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but you'll notice all that information that we entered through those commands that we ran is contained in this file. We've got our certificate authority, we've got our server, and there's that load balancer IP that we entered for this one. We have our username, and we have our certificates for the client certificate as well as the client certificate key. So all that information is actually now stored within this one single file. So now we have generated all the kubeconfigs that we're going to need in order to set up the Kubernetes cluster.